Hello, everyone. This is Philosophy of the People with Stefan Bertram and Ben Burgess, reporting in from a new flat.
Yes, Sam.
No, sorry, I was reporting. I was reporting for you. I'm in the same flat. Maybe
Okay.
be in a new flat
Yeah.
soon now. If
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
look,
Yeah.
I thought Mexico is constantly bathed in like a orange light, but
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's not a sunny enough day for the sepia to come in here. Uh,
yeah, I mean, you look. It looks like a very kind of English background you've got going on there.
yeah. Yeah. No, it is actually kind of, yeah. Like from where I'm sitting, I've got the desk set up by the window. I actually brought the writing desk down day before yesterday. I brought the second carload of my stuff down from California, and so I've got the desk set up in the window. So off to my right, I can see the ocean and some palm trees and stuff. But yeah, in here, I guess it could be anywhere.
And today we're going to be talking about, well, Marx and Aristotle, but also kind of what I think is the kind of interesting question about whether kind of the historic age we live in, kind of the material circumstances we're embedded in, kind of limits, if not makes impossible, certainly constrains and limits the possibility for philosophers to consider certain things.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. That the sort of ultimate conclusion. I mean, just to skip right to the head, right to the end, right of Marx's critique of Aristotle on value theory is that even though Marx thinks that Aristotle is a genius, I mean, and he really praises him a lot in ways that that you don't see Marx praising a lot of philosophers, and he and
Capital is a critique of political economy, not a kind of a complementary tour.
yes, yeah, exactly, and yeah, and really, like if you read the first chapter of Capital, I mean, a lot of the feel of it is very Aristotelian, right? Like in terms of the way that like Marx is setting up categories and making arguments and all that stuff. Uh, and he has a lot of I mean, he doesn't say a lot about him, but like the couple things that he says about Aristotle are very complimentary. But he ultimately thinks he's wrong, and the reason that he's giving for thinking that he's wrong is not any defect in Aristotle. It's a defect in the time that he's living in. And you're right. I mean, there is a sort of much more general issue that's like hovering in the background of all of this about, I mean, the extent to which we're all, prisoners of the era in which, in which we're living, and people in a people in future centuries will find it sort of incomprehensible, the things that we couldn't figure out. But it's not because we're not clever enough. It's because of limitations on our society. Oh yeah, that'll be. You can have three. Excused absences, and then after that, it's you're in capital class detention.
You won't lose any credits, be
Yeah,
they be social credits or the academic credits awarded at Ben Burgess University.
yeah, that's definitely how that works. But yeah, so it's let's see. Um, so I mean, one way into all this, I guess, is to just start thinking in a much more general sense about Marx's own views. I mean, that's certainly the way that I do it, in the essay, because I think often when people talk about Marxism, or throw that word around, right? Like often what they're really talking about is just like a political program, right? That so you might say that somebody is a Marxist as opposed to saying that they're like just a social democrat or something like that. Um, so at the very least, it's sort of, radical anti-capitalist politics, but, presumably having something to do with, class struggle. Um, and that's I think oftentimes what people mean when they throw around that term. But of course, if you're going to, get what Marx is doing in Capital, which is what this essay is about, right? That's where, that's what Marx is talking about Aristotle. Um, Obviously, that political program is like really important to understand because that's the context that you need to make sense of everything that Marx is doing. But he's, it's not, Capital is not the Communist Manifesto, right? It's not a exhortation to political action. There's really hardly any of that in that very long book. And so, I think the other way of using the term Marxism that's going to be more useful and relevant here is to use Marxism as the name of like not like a normative political program, but like a descriptive intellectual project, which I think, really has a couple of components, and they're both going to be relevant to the just like Marx's critique of Aristotle, but one of them is an overall theory of history, and then the other one is a sort of specific theory of the bit of history that he's most interested in, which is the capitalist mode of
The one
production.
he's in.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, because it's an interesting thing, right? I think we've talked about this before when we had our guest episode. One of the two we've
Uh,
had was
yeah,
the guy who's not a Marxist,
Tibor Rutar.
Thibault. That in some way there's kind of like a fundamental limit to how much Marxism you can do about Roman slave society, because you just simply just don't have the data, and you'll never have the data.
Yeah, no, that's true, right? It's an interesting question, actually. And
The Romans couldn't do Marxism because of their historically limited circumstances, and we can't do Marxism about the Romans because of our historically limited circumstances. Two
yeah,
different
I mean,
kinds of.
yeah, I mean, I guess there's also a question about what Marxism about the Romans would mean, right? I mean, if it's a sort of detail, if it's kind of an in-depth analysis of Roman class structures, maybe we could do that to a point. Although the data issue that you're talking about definitely,
Like a
definitely
lot
raises.
of kind of an analysis of like Marx's analysis of Romans is based off events which may be mythical or may have happened but not happened in exactly the way they're told, like the secession of the plebs
Oh yeah,
was,
yeah,
which we don't
yeah.
really know if it happened, and if it did happen, it probably didn't happen in nearly this clean way where everyone just went on like a physical strike on the morning and went off to a hill, you know.
Yeah, that's a fun example because okay, no, I like it because when you started to say all that, I was thinking it's like okay, sure, there's like a lot of early Roman history that like we don't actually have accurate information about, but how relevant is that going to be? But then, yeah, secession of the plebs is actually a great example because that's sort of I mean, in a way, that's kind of the Roman equivalent of like the, struggle for the 10-hour day that, Marx is writing about in chapter 8 of Capital. And yeah, and we're still firmly in the sort of shrouded in mythology, part of Roman history. Like if anybody, uh, you know, like I was a big fan of Mike Duncan's History of Rome podcast, which I don't even remember. It was like several hundred episodes or something. But and I remember when I first started to listen to that podcast, I was thinking it's like actually one of the reasons I was hesitating. I had friends who liked it. It was like, okay, so are like the first like 20 episodes going to be like, because like given like where he seems to be starting chronologically, is it could be like first 20 episodes, it could be like talking about what we can infer from shards of pottery. That doesn't sound like riveting listening. But then, of course, what he does, because Duncan's a good storyteller, is he sort of gives you half mythological stuff, and then at the end of the episode, it's like, yeah, but probably none of that happened. Uh, uh, that's kind of what you have to do for a lot of that. So yeah, that is actually a very good point. Although also interestingly enough, something one of there's this long footnote in Capital Chapter 1 that I'm talking about a lot for a lot of this essay, where Marx says something really interesting about the overall theory of history, and that might be relevant to like what Marxism about the Romans would look like. So he's talking about some German American newspaper that I don't know did like a critical review of one of his books or something, and in it, he says that newspaper said, well, okay, so Herr Marx, is understand like he thinks that like economics is like the sort of fundamental thing that explains everything, and that might be fine for for the capitalist period, when economics really does predominate, but come on, this doesn't make any sense as an overall theory of history, because clearly in the medieval period, religion is the most important thing, and in the ancient period, politics is the most important thing, and
Which sounds to us completely goofy, right?
Marx pushes back. Oh no, Stefan.
Hello? Am I here?
Oh yeah. Okay. Yeah. That is actually slightly worrying, because I was having on StreamYard lately. I've been. Oh no, Stefan.
Hi.
Hey, do you know what happened to that?
Well, seemingly nothing. Like for me, I was like on screen the whole time and everything.
Oh,
I have been
interesting.
having some problems where my Wi-Fi receptor just switches off, but that's actually not what was happening there.
Okay, because I thought, okay, is this me? Because it could have been. I have had internet problems in some recent streams. I was actually really hoping that.
No, it was funny because for me, both of us were fine. It was just me
Okay.
looking normal. Earlier, I did have a thing where again, Restream was telling me like, "Oh, there's an internet problem," but seemingly my internet was fine. And when I refreshed, it went back to normal. So it might be something wrong with Restream, but it seems it'll be fixed just by me refreshing. So we'll see.
Okay, that's good. Yeah. All right. Like I said, a little nervous because I'd had internet problems before that I actually thought were solved by now. But from what you're saying, it's probably not in this
I
sense.
think
So,
it's definitely not you. It might be a Restream problem. It might be my internet, but you're definitely fine.
okay, fair enough. Um, yeah. So yeah.
We were talking
So
about how it's goofy the idea that medieval Europe ran on religion. Like in some sense, it definitely ran on the Catholic Church, but that was part of a political economy, right?
yeah. Yeah. So I mean, Marx's answer to this is really interesting, because he does two things. He does push back, and like very much the way you're saying, but he also has this really interesting turn of phrase that says like, well, look, um, the sort of economic stuff at the foundation of society can tell us why it is that religion was so important in the medieval era, and politics in the ancient world. And so he does seem to be granting that there's a certain sense in which those had primacy in their societies, but he thinks ultimately the thing that explains whatever kind of primacy they had is still economics, right? Because he says, look, um, the Middle Ages couldn't live on Catholicism, right? Like that, you had to
Right. I
have
mean,
at the
it's this
basic.
idea of that's noted by Bergman, and it's directly from Marx of kind of the idea of the halo. I can't remember the exact quote, um, but there's this idea that basically, I mean, it's kind of like the thing we talked about before, where capitalism removes certain illusions while imposing new ones. Um, but there's the idea of kind of the removal of the halo in capitalism, where obviously the Romans it was essential that their political economy, but like merchants and stuff weren't respected or whatever.
Yeah.
And the Catholic Church was very firmly controlled Europe through its political economy, but it wouldn't want to talk about it in that way. But in capitalism is the era where, on a superstructural level, we're talking about like the grand force of the entrepreneur or whatever. So on a superstructural level, as well as kind of like a base level, capitalism is like economical in that sense.
Yeah. I mean, he says that it can't be. I mean, ultimately, I mean, just on a simple-minded level, if people are going to eat in your society, then somebody has to be producing food, and so that's that like line about how the Middle Ages couldn't have lived on Catholicism, and he's also elsewhere in the footnote. He's talking about Bastiat, the French politician, economic theorist, and and Bastiat is saying that like the Greeks and Romans lived off of plunder, and he's making a structurally similar point there. He's saying, well, I mean, has to be something to plunder, right? If people are going to live off of plunder, and so there therefore has to be somebody producing the stuff that is being plundered. So it's and so Marx thinks that this is ultimately even if again there's like some sense in which Catholicism is sort of playing the starring role in the Middle Ages and the in politics in the ancient world, that like if you want to understand that whole setup, the thing that's ultimately going to be the most explanatory is how how all the stuff is being produced, how most people are spending most of their days, that at the base of society, and he thinks, so he quotes himself from 8 years earlier, right, in his 1859 preface when he, sure, that about how the relations of production, in any given society, do you have lords and serfs, do you have workers and capitalists, are ultimately going to be what's going to what's going to explain the legal and political superstructure, the forms of consciousness, and that the relations of production themselves are going to be downstream of the level of development of the forces of production. And there's actually a surprising amount of stuff in chapter 1 about the sort of overall theory of history. Maybe because at the beginning of Capital, I think Marx is doing something slightly strange in how he starts out Capital, because it's it's a book about capitalism, of course, but he sort of announces in chapter 1 that for the next little while he's not actually going to be talking about capitalism per se, right? Capitalism is a class structure at all, right? Like he actually says in one of the footnotes to chapter 1, at this stage of the analysis, wage labor does not exist, right? So he
we'll get there.
So he's it's but like the way he starts out, right, like the opening sentence, he says that the wealth of all societies where the capitalist mode of production predominates takes the form of an immense collection of commodities. And so it seems like what he's announcing in effect is, okay, look, whatever else is true about capitalism, right, whatever else is going on here, at the very least, this is a society that revolves around the production of commodities. So let's just think about how that works in general before we really get into the sort of things about it that really make it capitalist, right? The relations between workers and capitalists, right? The capitalist relations of production. And so, he spends like a lot of time there. Like, chapter 1 is pretty long, chapter 2 is kind of short, but like chapter 3 is a monster. Like those first 3 chapters, that section on money and commodities, is actually like a pretty big part of the book when you kind of break it all down. I mean, so I think that part of what he's doing at the end of chapter 1 is he's sort of reminding you of why we're interested in all this, right? Because it's like, look, you haven't opened up a textbook on like how markets and prices work, right? I mean, that's not what capital is. You're interested in reading about capitalism, right, from a socialist perspective. And so I think at the end of the chapter, he makes a big point of sort of looping back to that larger subject and sort of started to think about how it feeds into this sort of larger picture of the stages of history, right? He's just finished talking about these, how much economists love Robinson Crusoe examples. You have somebody wash up on a desert island and they have to figure stuff out from scratch. And he's just gone through his discussion of that. And then he says, well, let's go from Crusoe's sunny island to the darkness of medieval Europe. And he talks about feudalism a little bit. And then he fast forwards all the way to talking about capitalism and to talk about socialism, right? So it's like, so it goes through, very quickly from, feudalism to capitalism to socialism. Is actually one of the only things that he says about socialism in that entire book. And it says like the Society of Associated Producers in the future. And the point he's making there is kind of what you said a minute ago about how in the political economy of feudalism really explains most of the most important things that are going on in feudal society, but it sort of doesn't wear it on its sleeve. It's like, yeah, there are people who are engaged in economic activity, but that's sort of dirty and, and unsavory and don't focus too much on that. Right. Whereas in capitalism, that's exactly what they want you to focus. I mean, this is the guy who used to be president of the United States and very likely will be again in 6 months, wrote a book called The Art of the Deal, which is part of the genre of like celebration.
Alleged kind of reactionary aristocratic people on Twitter, or like calling Baron Trump like the chief aristocrat because he's from like a dirty money family, but he's also like tall and looks cool. That's kind of the end of feudal reactionary aristocratic politics.
Yeah, I mean, well, this is also kind of a weird cycle within capitalist society that, you sort of get these cycles of like, how much do we like talking about how the money is, where the money came from, and how much do we not like talking about where the money came from? And so do you get your like, so there's obviously like a huge strain of, pro-capitalist rhetoric that's all about like sort of glorying in entrepreneurial hustle, right? I mean, the art of the deal definitely fits in there. But then eventually, I think because, by the time capitalism emerged, you were in societies that already had aristocracies and that culturally set the tone. So, eventually once people had their money for a while, right, there's always this temptation to sort of like, oh, no, we actually want to be classy money now and sort of pretend that we didn't do anything to get it. And it just, it's just sort of always existed. And then,
right, it's hard to do the pretense in the US, right, where you never really had a pre-capitalist society.
Yeah. I mean, the pre-capitalist societies in the U.S. were, didn't develop into this
they
one.
Lost out.
Yeah, they were replaced by this one by and large, right? So, yeah, no, that's totally right. So there is like a sort of very limited pretense there. I mean, this is like, yeah, I mean, this is like sort of the cliche, right? That like what counts as like an old building or an old city or an old university in the U.S. is kind of ludicrous by old world standards, right? I remember uh, that I remember going to visit. I think it was like a suburb of Vienna, and I was told that there was like a building there that was referred to as the Neue Kirche because the Alte Kirche was destroyed by the Turks, right? Which would be a event that would happen considerably before, the oldest stuff that we consider really old. I mean, it's like my God, right? It's like way before uh, immense amount of time before like Harvard was founded or any of that stuff. So yeah, you gotta have to sort of do old money in an American context. You have to grade on a weird curve, and so you let money count as old. That's pretty new in the grand scheme of things. But
Do you know how old the Newcastle is in Newcastle?
how old is it?
It's 1,000 years old. It's
That sounds right.
1080.
That sounds right. Yeah. So, um, so yeah, in under so when you compare these different forms of society, oftentimes some of the same things will be going on in them, but which ones are sort of openly celebrated and which ones are covered up is going to vary a lot, between societies. And one of the big points that Marx makes at the end of chapter 1, there's some room for interpretation here, but he talks, is about commodity fetishism, where he says that, because capitalism, whatever else it is a market society, there's this tendency to sort of assign this weird kind of autonomy to what goes on in the market. So that says social relations between people are like take the appearance of of like autonomous relations between things, right? Between commodities, right? It's got a joke at the beginning of chapter 2 about how sadly commodities can't take themselves to markets. They need us as their guardians, to take them and exchange them, right?
Yeah, no, they
But
can't reproduce by themselves either.
yeah, well, that's the really important part, that they can't reproduce by themselves. They have to be produced by us, and I think this is the real point about commodity fetishism. That, I mean, even if you think about the sort of simplifying assumption in the first few chapters of Capital, that okay, wage labor doesn't even exist yet at the stage of the analysis. We're just thinking about like markets in general, as if we were all producing, like we were all growing our own food, or we were all everybody was just producing and then exchanging what they themselves had produced. Even so, even in that scenario, there's still a social relation between people that's sort of being obscured by its form as a relation between things, between the commodities. Because ultimately, what are we doing if if I'm a baker and you're a fisherman, and I exchange some of my loaves for some of your fishes, right? Like, what are we ultimately doing? We're making an agreement that, like, I'm going to spend a certain number of hours of my life baking, and you're going to spend a certain number of hours of your life fishing. And like, that's so there is ultimately this human relationship there that's been obscured. And certainly then when you get into labor markets, that's absolutely going to be true. I mean, that you have this that you have something. I mean, this is like one of the key points of Capital, that at a certain level of analysis is very much like pre-capitalist class societies, that you ultimately have a class of subordinate laborers who are who are being compelled to work for a ruling class, but it doesn't wear that on its sleeve. I mean, it is this, since it takes the form, which is in some ways accurate, in some ways misleading, of a free exchange, in the marketplace, between equals. So you have, so there's a sense in which you have, when you go from feudalism to capitalism, um, what was once sort of right out in the open has become obscure, but there's also a sense in which the other way around is true, right? That that what under feudalism was totally opaque has become totally clear. That we talked about this. We were talking about the previous essay about capital. That under feudalism, there's this elaborate pretense that there's this sort of meaningful human relationship between people in different parts of the economic hierarchy, whereas under capitalism, it's sort of very, very, very openly instrumental, right? That the like, nobody, hey, I gave you a job because I want to make money, and the second I'm not anymore, sorry, right? And so then the hope that he's pointing towards in that passage is that under in the future this society of associated producers, the way that things work will once again be open because there really isn't any need to to obscure it anymore, right? So that's the overall sort of view about history. But then where all this connects to Aristotle is when Marx is giving Bastiat. I would always, anytime I say a French word or name, you should always assume that however it's supposed to be said is something other than what I said. But that guy, when Marx is giving him a hard time for saying Greeks and Romans, we're living off of plunder, and so he sort of makes the first objection that, well, okay, that has to be something going on at the economic base of society for there to be something to plunder. Then he says, hey, it's possible that what Bastiat means is that a society where the underlying production relations are slavery, that's plunder. But if so, he's on dangerous ground. Presumably what he means by dangerous ground is because, capitalism is also a society based on class exploitation. And he says, if even a giant like Aristotle could be wrong, if a giant like Aristotle could be wrong about slavery, then why should a dwarf economist like Bastiat, be right about wage labor, which is, just a small point, but it's like the kind of thing that makes me think that Marx would have done very well on Twitter. But then, then the part of the chapter that I'm particularly interested in for this essay is the other mention of Aristotle, which ultimately has to do with slavery also, and I think relates to what he's saying in that footnote, which is about the labor theory of value. That
Have I lost Ben this time?
Marx in chapter 1 of Capital makes these tested.
Hello?
All right, I heard that. Can you hear me?
Yeah. You
Okay.
seem normal again.
Okay.
I think it was you that time.
Yeah, because I got a little message. I didn't before, but this time I got a little message on the top saying, "Oops, your connection is something."
Yeah, I got that message not during the show, but beforehand.
Okay.
So the first time I've seen it, I don't know if it's a new error from them. But the second bit of Aristotle?
Yeah, so the second bit of Aristotle is talking about the labor theory of value. So Marx's comments on value in chapter 1 are the subject of a lot of interpretive controversy, but for these purposes in the essay, I'm going with the sort of a very simple-minded on the surface reading of what he's saying. that I happen to think is probably right, but that he so Marx says that value is that value is the value of a product, of a commodity, is the average amount of socially necessary labor time in the abstract that it takes to produce it. So the reason for, you know, average socially necessary is that Marx thinks, well, it'd be kind of ridiculous to say that like a commodity is more valuable because the person who made it was like lazy or bad at their job and they took longer to produce it. And the bit about it in the abstract is a little bit more obscure, but the sort of basic idea is that Marx starts out thinking about exchange value, says that it's like, okay, so we have this intuitive idea that like a certain amount of one commodity is worth a certain amount of another, in market exchanges. But what do we really mean by worth? Because and he sort of goes through all this effort in chapter 1 to say that, look, it must be, if given the sort of sheer variety of things that can be exchanged for other things, and in fact, I think a big part of Marx's point in all of this is that money, in a certain sense, is beside the point. That you have, because it's not that there's like something, there's not really something special about money as opposed to any other commodity, right? That what's going on when you exchange a product for dollars or pounds or euros is not essentially different from what's going on when you exchange it for some other product in a barter way. And in fact, I think a lot of the subtext to this is that he's pushing back against other critics of capitalism, like maybe Proudhon, as he understands Proudhon, who
want to fight with money.
Want to fight with money, right? And he's saying it's like, no, this is you're just sort of missing the point here, right? Money is not, money is not really the problem, right? That like if you have a system of commodity exchange, in other words, a market, then look, you could in principle have that, without money. I mean, there are certainly times and places that you do have some version of that without money. And, by the time you get to elaborate enough markets to support, capitalist class structures, it's sort of extremely hard to imagine that existing in a totally moneyless way, because it would be incredibly unwieldy and inefficient.
Right,
But
have to be like enforced by aliens or something.
Yeah, I mean, you could, in principle, have that, right? I mean, maybe like capitalists, as they're accumulating profits, would just have to spend a tremendous amount of like a tremendous amount of real estate on all their warehouses full of of the commodities they were accumulating, because they couldn't just put them into the form of money.
It
But
would
like,
be interesting to do some kind of sci-fi story about a planet where like everything rots within like a week. And like no, you can't have coins in that sense, and it's even hard to keep ledgers because they have to be constantly transcribed and copied.
yeah. Yeah, one of the things I was thinking about with the warehouses is you'd at least want to be, even if there was no single commodity that you could exchange for all the others, you'd at least want to focus on accumulating dry goods to keep them in your warehouses for longer. But yeah, look, you could even in principle have wage labor without money. It would just be that the employment contracts were, you're being paid in kind and goods, right? And presumably including stuff like, food and clothing and shelter and all that, which, in fact, in a way, you can argue that the history of actually existing capitalism has at least pockets of something that sort of look like that in 19th century company towns, where people were paid not in money, but in like scrip that was only redeemable at the company store. And people lived in company-owned housing and all of that stuff. Um,
But
so yeah,
these
it's
were
so
just like self-contained, right? They were always
yeah,
about kind of they've been porting commodities made by other people with money into this place, selling them with this script and in such a way to like intensify the exploitation of labor, and then use that to for profit, get rid
yeah.
of all
I
the
mean,
underproducts.
totally. All the companies that had company towns were still like interacting on a larger market. That so this is why it's just
They
pockets.
weren't just basically like a cult.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, if the but you take this far enough. I mean, I guess you've got to, you know, I mean, if it's totally self-contained, then you've got sort of a, maybe like a very normatively distasteful version of like the Soviet economy or something, right? But yeah, in the but yes, of course, these are this is all interacting with larger markets. So and there's a reason, right, why even those instances of like wage labor without like real money were always like pockets within an economy where you did have real money, because it just makes everything immensely easier, right? That this is you don't need warehouses full of your wealth. You can just pay people in wages, and like money wages, all this stuff. So yeah, it makes everything just immensely more efficient. Certainly, once you get to the more complicated aspects of capitalist economic activities, it's very hard to imagine. Somebody was pointing this out in class today. It's like, just try to imagine like the conversation with like a stockbroker or something in the world without money, right? That the like how how all that would be represented. But in any case, so Marx thinks that okay, so forget whether it's money or not. That's beside the point. He thinks, right, that you know it's commodities have exchange value, and money is just sort of a special kind of commodity that has almost no use value except for exchange value. Um, he does point out that it does still have some other. Uh, so yeah, money is a special kind of commodity that has almost no use value except for exchange value. It is almost. He points out in chapter 2 that in lots of societies where gold is the money commodity, gold is still used to fill teeth, right? So it does have some, but it has almost none. But like, yeah, whether you're exchanging for gold, or you're doing like the prison equivalent and you're exchanging for cigarettes, or whether you're just like engaged in a complicated system of bartering without a universal equivalent, one way or the other, you're saying, okay, this much of this thing is worth that much of this other thing. And so so the question is, for Marx, is, well, hold on, like, what is it? There must be something, he thinks, right, that these things all have in common that ground those equivalences. And you start to think about this, that like, okay, this many yards of linen is worth a coat, but it's also worth like a gallon of gasoline. It's also worth a Substack subscription. It's also worth whatever, right? You keep going through all the list of commodities, and the list is so heterogeneous that Marx thinks, well, it can't possibly, like, whatever it is that these things all have in common, it can't be anything about the physical makeup of the commodities, because that just varies too much. And it can't even be can't be about their use value. That's too different. So what do they all have in common? Well, they're all products of human labor. He does introduce some exceptions to that in chapter 3, but at this point, they're all products of human labor. And so there are people who are putting a certain amount of hours of their life into producing it, and he thinks that it, and but again, even the labor that's producing it is so heterogeneous that it's just like the common thing must be this like extremely abstract sense of labor that you get when you just subtract everything that's like specific about it, right? That's the average socially necessary labor time in the abstract. In fact, you're abstracted so many specifics that Marx makes this really odd comment in chapter 1 about how, which he seems to think is sort of straightforward, but many people have thought it's not straightforward, who've read it, about how like skilled labor is just a more concentrated form of unskilled labor as far as thinking about labor time, right? The skilled labor reduction problem, and he sort of says that's obvious that that's true, and again, is it obvious? I don't know, but anyway, so he thinks that labor in this extremely abstract sense, or labor time, in the abstract sense, is the the value of all commodities that sort of underlines these exchange value ratios. And there are all sorts of interesting questions you could ask about which of Marx's arguments later in the book sort of need that premise and which ones don't, right? That like you can say this sort of extremely technical, like the labor theory of value in this extremely technical way, might be important for some things, whereas there might be other contexts where all that really matters is, the labor theory of value in a very loose sense, that, workers are producing the products that, that are being exchanged, at the market and all of that. The capitalists aren't producing them, the workers are producing them. That might be all that you need for some of Marx's arguments. All interesting questions, but we can put all that aside, because the thing that I find really interesting is where he brings up Aristotle again in all this, because he says that Aristotle, who he praises again, great investigator, comes very close to making this argument that we just went over, that he gets like 9/10 of the way there, but he doesn't quite make it. That Aristotle, he quotes this place in the Nicomachean Ethics where Aristotle sort of talks about exchange ratios. He uses the example of 5 beds is worth 1 house, which I have to admit really throws me when I think about this. I can't quite figure out whether to think of that as ancient Greek beds being incredibly expensive or ancient Greek houses being incredibly cheap.
Yeah, I mean, even what's a bed in ancient Greece?
I don't
I mean,
know.
obviously, you start imagining like a mattress with a frame, but that's almost certainly not what they were using.
Yeah, no way they were using that. And then, yeah, I guess there's a follow-up question about the house, and anyway, who knows? But yeah, so Aristotle sort of said, like, kind of raises the question that Marx has raised. He's like, well, these things must all have something in common. But then he kind of ends up concluding that, yeah, I guess not, right?
Because what could it be?
Yeah, what could it be? I don't know. I'm stumped. I guess they don't actually. I guess there actually isn't this underlying, monadic quality that these relations, undergirds all these relations. And yeah, and Marx. So Marx has this really interesting speculation about why Aristotle, like, who again he sees as this great genius, couldn't make it all the way to this insight about this sort of universal human labor, in the abstract being the thing that underlies all of this. And he says that it's because Aristotle is the product of a slave society where, and people, couldn't really think of like equal human labor because the whole basis of social arrangements is that you aren't really thinking of everybody as like a person who's doing the same kind of, activity. regardless of where they are in the social structure. So that you know, he says Greek society was founded on the labor of slaves, hence had its natural basis the inequality of men and their labor powers. The secret of the expression of value, namely the equality and equivalence of all kinds of labor, because and insofar as their labor in general could not be deciphered until the concept of human equality had already acquired the permanence of a fixed popular opinion. And, I think this connects to a bunch of other things that Marx says in chapter 1, where he, like when he's introducing, he's kind of plotting his way through all these examples about, yards of linen being worth pounds of coffee and all that stuff. He, he spices it up with all of these analogies to, observations about humans. And he says things like let's see, within its value relation to the linen, the coat signifies more than it does outside of it, just as some men count for more within a gold-braided uniform than they do otherwise. Civil society, a general or banker plays a great part, but man as such plays a very mean part. So here the same is true of human labor. Nevertheless, the coat cannot represent value toward the linen unless value for the latter simultaneously assumes the form of the coat. An individual A, for instance, cannot be your majesty to another individual B unless majesty in B's eyes assume the physical shape of A, and moreover changes facial features, hair, and many other things with every new father of the people. And
That seems a bit of a pointless one.
yeah. No,
Humans.
there it seems like Marx really just wants to say that thing about kings, and like, his really wedging it in there. But then he says something very similar about kings. And do we just glitch out for a second?
You were struggling there.
Yeah. So he has all these like metaphors and allusions that the point of it seems to be that it's that there are all these things about forms of society that mask the fact that people are all just kind of people, and there aren't really like sort of innate natural differences between them that that explain the social differentiation. And so it seems like his claim about Aristotle is, well, the problem is Aristotle's living in a slave society, and the idea that there's like the idea that there's natural differentiation between people underlying the social differentiation like almost has to exist in a really extreme form for you to live in that society, right? Like if you have it, like, so Aristotle himself, of course, notoriously, makes some comments about, I think elsewhere, even the ethics. Anyway, they, make some comments about natural slaves, right? Aristotle thinks it's only wrong to enslave people who aren't natural slaves. And, that's Aristotle in particular, but like in general, how could you possibly function in a society like that if you didn't on some level believe something like that?
Right. I think Athens was like the highest density slave society in history. Do you know
yeah.
the Athenian play The Assembly Woman?
Uh,
It's like a satirical play about women taking over Athenian society and
sure. Yeah.
imposing
Hilarious. Yes.
like proto-communism,
Uh,
and like they abolish private property and so on. And at some point, the assembly woman or women, they get challenged on the question of, well, who's going to till the fields? And she says, well, the slaves are going to till the fields. And that's meant as a joke also in the play. But I think it's a joke in a different sense to how we would understand it, where the point being made there by kind of the male character in that exchange and by the play is that the funny point is that the woman doesn't recognize that she lacks in the same way the slave lacks.
Right, right. Yeah, yeah, exactly, right. So, I mean, you have to, yeah, if you're going to live in, certainly if you're going to live in the highest density slave society in history, then, if you've like really internalized the idea that these are all people who are just like you are, then that would be totally intolerable. You go insane, right? Like you have to tell yourself some kind of story where that's not the case. So you have to think about them as being a really different category. And, in the, in the same way, right? I mean, okay, actually, let me put this differently. So in that, I think the point here is not that there's some sort of like logical incompatibility between, having, believing that some people are natural slaves or whatever, and believing labor theory of value. There's not, right? I mean, that's is, there's like there can't be, right, on different sides of the Izok gap, but I think that it's rather just that you're just not going to, if you're used to thinking of these as like this fundamentally different category of human, then it's you're a lot less likely to sort of let your mind go wandering in directions to like, what's in common between like, what I'm doing, what some like, free craftsman is doing, and, what the
Right.
slave
I
is
mean,
doing.
you'll struggle then to kind of keep any idea of, like this is virtuous craft. If you're
Yeah.
having to admit they're all kind of fundamentally the same,
Yeah.
um, which
I,
kind of, I think, gets us back around to like MAGA communism and so on.
sure. I suppose.
Because I think a lot of people, obviously, I think even for people living in capitalist society, this idea that all labor is fundamentally the same is something we don't really want to accept. Uh,
Yeah.
we want to like valorize certain groups, and who those groups are depends on who we are. But I think there's a pretty much universal kind of desire, which isn't always politically expressed because some people know to resist it. Um, but I think there's a desire in all of us to valorize certain kinds of labor.
Yeah. No, that seems totally right. That, that this is, yeah, I mean, if an hour of my, I mean, yeah, this is even the kind of point that Proudhon makes, right? I mean, that there's like the sort of, 15 minutes of the lawyer's time, being treated as equivalent to, weeks of, a small farmer has to deal with them. Um, yeah, I think that, so, one analogy that occurred to me last time I was talking about this is that it's like, look, like Marx, for example, takes it for granted that there's a big difference between like the role of machines in production and the role of human beings, right? Just thinking of those as two very different kinds of things, right? You could, I suppose, imagine a society perhaps after a successful robot uprising where, people weren't really making a big distinction there. And, there might be other ways of thinking about this that would occur to them that, wouldn't occur to us. But like, but we, we put those in like really different, like, metaphysical kind of categories, that and so similarly, if Aristotle's living in a society where, where he, it's easy to think of like what slaves do as different from what free people are doing as what machines are doing, compared to human labor, right? Then yeah, you're just less likely to be able to stretch your mind to think about sort of absolutely general abstract, human labor, right? Because again, you have to have, like it's not just that like Aristotle in particular was a bad guy, right? It's that how could you possibly exist in that society without without believing something like this?
It was funny when I was reading this book about slavery in the ancient Mediterranean, and they were talking about how they were trying to explain the condition of slaves in Athens, and they were like, "Well, the modern thing it's most similar to is wage labor,
Yeah.
because basically what most kind of like at least valuable slaves in Athens did, like in Athens city, was that they would work at a kind of facility provided by their masters, and they would make things and sell things, and then they would teeth a certain fixed amount of what they made to their master. Of course, there were other kind of slaves where the difference is more fundamental, and kind of the justification for slavery seems more obvious. In that, for instance, they also had I think it was silver mining, not gold mining, but Athens had big silver mines, and the method they had of mining there in any way which was effective just killed you. Like
Yeah.
it killed a lot of people very very fast. And then there was obviously no way for love nor money to get free laborers to do that. And so they were like, well, this is something you fundamentally need slaves to do this.
Yeah. I mean, this is the. I mean, this is one way of sort of making really vivid the idea that the level of development of the forces of production can explain what kind of relations of production you get. Situations like that, or or like I don't know, like early, you know, like pre-revolutionary Haiti. Uh, the I don't remember off the top of my head, but I remember that the like average lifespan for slaves who were imported into Haiti was like absurd. It was like a
I
few
mean,
years.
Marx talks about it in Capital, right? Because he specifically does. He talks about how in the West Indies, in a certain point, I think obviously before he was writing, because he was writing after the slave trade had been abolished, but at some point in the early 19th century, the average lifespan of an imported slave was 3 years. But he uses that to make the point that in certain factories which have produced heavy dust in Manchester,
Uh,
kill you even quicker than that.
yeah, I mean but like yeah, generally speaking, if you have like if you're doing like sugarcane harvesting in the conditions that it was being done in Saint Domingue, then like it's very hard to see how that would have happened with a free labor force, right? I mean, this is
Right, and they
just
had to adapt how things were produced in the antebellum South once they were stopped from doing the slave trade.
yeah, right, because there's a lot of things you could yeah. So you have
And then
not
slaves led long and pleasant lives instead of short and pleasant lives.
yeah. Yeah, because you're just not going to get people to volunteer to to do that. I mean, this is actually something that which is one of the reasons why, in fact, in early post-revolutionary Haiti, the abolition of slavery happened by some sort of very strange stages, because the successful revolutionaries were sort of struggling with like, how do we stop the economy from completely collapsing? If we don't, if we like really do what we said we would do, and yeah, I think that it's and by the way, I should say, Sandwich in the GTA chat, I believe, said says opinions and values are always socially constructed, question mark. Well, not necessarily, right? Like you don't have to make the strong claim, right, that like facts about the kind of society that you're living in explains like everything about what people think, or that like it's that everything's determined by that, in order to make the weak claim that the sort of range of things that you're going to think is going to be heavily limited, right? By facts about
There's been a
society.
lot of abject nonsense posted in the GTA chat tonight, which I unfortunately couldn't directly reply to as Ben was speaking because I can't post in the GTA chat from here.
All
But I would
right.
say
Well,
to people out there that don't forget that social constructs are real. A social contract does not describe something which is not real. Rather, it describes something which is real, which is being constructed by human hands
Yeah,
in a specific
yeah,
social manner. But
yeah.
apparently, the average lifespan for slaves in the United States in 1850 was 36, which sounds very low, but apparently the average lifespan for a white American at the time was 40.
Uh, uh, yeah, I mean, governments are social constructs. This is, which is actually, I will grant, I think is like a problem because I think in certain contexts, a lot of people want to use the phrase socially constructed to sort of suggest not real,
Yeah,
right? Where like what they really mean, because it's like,
it's
yeah,
contingent in a kind of quite
yeah,
straightforward way.
yeah, exactly, right. Like, because there's a world of difference between saying that something's imaginary and that it's contingently real. And I think that sometimes uses of the phrases like social construct and socially constructed sort of waver between the two in an unhelpful way, right? But yeah, I think that. But yeah, in any case, on this, I think you can say that there's like there could be like ways in which particular societies that people live in at particular times like limit the range of things that they'll be able to figure out. But that's consistent with saying that it's not like deep facts about the society are sort of determining everything that everybody thinks or anything, or that nobody can make contact with the truth about external reality in any way or anything like that, right? Like it's the plausible claim is way weaker than any of that.
GTA is socially constructed. Yeah, I think nearly entirely it's kind of socially constructed. There's obviously some concrete objects involved, but
Yeah, but I mean, there are concrete objects that it manifests in, right? But
supervenes are.
supervenes on, nice, yeah. Uh,
But yeah, obviously the microphone and whatever could be used for something completely different. For
yeah,
exactly
yeah,
like
yeah.
without it changing in itself in any way.
Yeah, I mean, right, exactly. Like it's itself. I mean, it's like an abstract object, but it's not like an abstract object like the number three that arguably, that it wouldn't be crazy to think has always existed, whether or not anybody was aware of it. Right?
Someone in the
GTA is
GTA chat asks, "What is GTA?"
awesome. Yeah, give them an argument. The show in which you were watching. Um, yeah, which has not always existed pretty clearly, right? Like so, which hence social construct. But yeah, I don't know. Aristotle good, Marx better. We got anything else for today?
No, I mean my show last week went well.
Oh, nice.
Um,
Yeah, yeah. I have a. Yeah, I just caught a minute of it, and I don't know if you saw my supportive chat.
no, I think I didn't.
Okay, I
Was it
said if
right at the end or?
no, it was pretty early on. I said I popped up in the chat to say I'm probably not going to be able to see most of this live. I just wanted to say that I just wanted to preemptively throw Stefan under the bus if they end up saying anything bad.
No, I guess I was probably just too focused on the doing because
Yeah, yeah.
it was
No,
good because
what I watched looked interesting. I haven't seen the whole thing.
with the PowerPoint feature, it was much easier to read chat than when you're reading off a script, and then not lose your thread. But still, I missed plenty. But no, it was good. Obviously, it wasn't philosophy.
Yeah,
It was discourse analysis, but it was fun.
that's
I
fun.
mean, there was some normative stuff in there, so whatever.
Fair enough.
And what did you write this week? And are we going to do that? What are you thinking of writing next week? And what do you think we're going to do the show on?
Yeah. So what I wrote this week, which we could very well do the show on next week, is a essay called "The District 9 Objection to Metaphysics," which the setup is something I've thought about many times over the years, which is Back in 2009, I went with a friend of mine to go see the science fiction movie District 9, and it was a friend from graduate school. And there's a scene in the movie where what's essentially a small alien child just sort of intuits the controls on an intergalactic spaceship, and it seemed pretty implausible. And
That reminds me. I read a sci-fi book recently called "The Mote in God's Eye,"
Okay, I don't know.
um, and various stuff happens. But one of the interesting things about this alien species is they. Well, this is kind of a main spoiler, but who cares? It's a sci-fi book from the 1970s. This species has to reproduce or they die, which
Okay,
leads to this constant, like intensive. Even when they reach civilization, they still have like pre-civilizational kind of boom bust population cycles,
yeah,
which leads to apocalypse and so on. And so there's intelligent species, but they constantly have this collapses. So they've been intelligent species for hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years. Normally, spent most of the time in kind of the Stone Age, as humans did. But then through so many cycles of this, that they naturally evolved to be tool users. And
okay.
so they were like, so like they would get to the alien spaceship and be able to intuit how it works in the same way that we were able to intuit things about our natural environment, because they hadn't become tool users through a process of kind of like social teaching and sub specific kind of like flexible higher consciousness things. Rather, they'd become tool users like almost by rote over hundreds of thousands of years of natural evolution.
Right. Yeah. So unless that happened, this seemed very implausible. And I remember as we were leaving the theater, we were kind of laughing about this. My friend made some comment about how she thought this was like, you know, like she said something like, yeah, like that's kind of what we do, though, right? Like, i.e., like there's a lot of philosophy that sort of um, seems like you're trying to figure out things that you could not possibly figure out given the information that's available to you. And so what the essay is sort of like exploring the sense in which this kind of concern makes, might or might not make it impossible to do certain kinds of metaphysics. And if you can, like, uh if it is okay despite that to like try to figure out metaphysical issues, then how does that work? Can we maybe like justify some of this stuff by saying that, like, really we're not arguing about how reality is, we're just we're just sort of we're just sort of trying, having verbal disputes about how to talk, or that there could be some descriptive issues that are really normative, or what do could there actually be situations in which, like, none of these excuses apply? We are clearly just doing metaphysics, but that's sort of okay anyway. So that's what the essay is about.
That sounds cool. I might have to read that just regardless.
All right, sounds good.
Um, what essay are you planning on writing? Do you know?
What's that?
What essay are you planning on writing this week? Do you know?
Oh, this week, yeah. So I actually have a rough draft. It's already it's called Euthyphro on Twitter, or the joys and frustrations of arguing about philosophy on the internet.
Having to do with atheism in particular, or just generally?
Yeah. The example has to do with atheism in particular. That I have over the last week, for I keep running into people, sometimes very surprising sources, right? Places I wouldn't expect it, who are sort of oddly asserting something like divine command ethics, and it's and so some of it's about what's wrong with that, and then some of it's about just kind of some of the odd features of of how these how these things play out. When people talk about this stuff on social media.
Kyle sent you $20, man.
All right, thank you, Kyle.
It was in the GTA chat, so it's your $20. It's not Jason's.
Oh, I didn't think you could put the GTA chat on the display.
Yeah, I can do everything. I can even ban people in the GTA chat, which is funny.
That is funny.
I know. I can do everything with the GTA chat, apart from I can't type in their chat. So it's this one-sided thing where I can bring them up on screen and I can exile them, or I can stop them from typing.
But the only thing okay, so you really are, you really are like a hidden god, who sets up all the conditions, but can't actually just directly make your.
But
make
yeah, if I want to talk to them, I have to speak over you, basically.
Fair enough. Well, thank you, Kyle. Much appreciated. I'll think about you when I pick up my pizza tonight.
Hell yeah! At Mexican prices, that $20 will go far.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Pile of stack of pizza.
Oh dear. Where's the outro button? Bye everyone.